Captain James Mitchell had served the royal family for 23 years. His weathered hands gripped the morning report as he stood in the cold stone corridor of Windsor Castle. At 51, he had seen 3 generations of royals grow up behind these ancient walls, but nothing had prepared him for what Prince George would do on this ordinary Tuesday morning. The young prince, now 15, walked past the security checkpoint with his usual polite nod. James noticed something different in the boy's eyes today. There was a determination that hadn't been there yesterday. George's footsteps echoed through the marble hallway as he made his way to the breakfast room where his family waited. James had watched George transform from a shy 7-year-old into a thoughtful teenager who questioned everything around him. The prince had always been curious about life beyond the palace walls, but lately his questions had become more pointed. He asked about homeless people he glimpsed from car windows, about children who couldn't afford school uniforms, about families struggling to pay for medicine. The security briefing that morning had been routine. James reviewed the day's schedule with his team of 12 guards. Prince George would attend his private tutoring sessions, have lunch with his grandmother, and then participate in a charity photography session for a children's hospital. Everything seemed perfectly normal and predictable, but George had other plans brewing in his young mind. For weeks he had been researching something in secret, using the palace's library computers when no one was watching. He had discovered stories of young activists around the world who were making real changes in their communities. These stories filled him with both inspiration and frustration about his own protected life. The breakfast room buzzed with quiet conversation as the royal family gathered around the mahogany table. Prince William discussed his upcoming environmental summit while Catherine reviewed plans for her early childhood development initiative. Queen Elizabeth sat at the head of the table, reading through official documents while sipping her morning tea. George pushed his scrambled eggs around his plate, his mind elsewhere. He had made a decision that would shock everyone, including the man who had protected him since he was barely old enough to walk. James stood silently by the door, unaware that this would be one of the last mornings he would watch over the young prince in the same way. The morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the breakfast table. George looked up at James, their eyes meeting briefly. In that moment, the experienced guard felt a chill run down his spine. Something was about to change forever. After breakfast, George excused himself and walked to his private study. James followed at a respectful distance as he had done thousands of times before. The prince sat at his desk and pulled out a piece of paper he had hidden in his textbook. His hands trembled slightly as he began to write what would become the most important letter of his young life. The castle continued its daily rhythm around them. Servants prepared for the afternoon's events, gardeners tended to the grounds, and security guards maintained their vigilant watch. None of them knew that within hours, everything would change because of a 15-year-old boy's brave decision to follow his conscience rather than protocol. James checked his watch and noted that George seemed unusually quiet during his morning lessons. The tutors reported that the prince appeared distracted, staring out the window more than focusing on his mathematics and history books. Little did anyone know that George was gathering courage for what he planned to do that very afternoon. The charity photography session was scheduled to begin at 2 p.m. George arrived at the designated room where photographers and hospital representatives waited eagerly. These events usually followed a careful script, but today, the young prince had different intentions. James positioned himself near the doorway, watching as George shook hands with the hospital director and posed for the traditional photographs. The prince smiled politely, but James could sense the tension in his shoulders. Something was building inside the boy like pressure in a steam kettle. "Your Royal Highness, we're so grateful for your support," the hospital director said, presenting George with a folder containing information about their work. "Your presence means everything to the sick children we serve." George accepted the folder and studied its contents carefully. Inside were photographs of young patients, many of them his own age, fighting serious illnesses. Some were bald from chemotherapy treatments, others connected to medical equipment, but all of them were smiling bravely at the camera. "Tell me about this boy," George said, pointing to a photograph of a 12-year-old with bright eyes despite his obvious illness. "What's his story?" The hospital director, surprised by the prince's genuine interest, began explaining how the boy had been battling cancer for 2 years. His family had struggled to afford treatments and they had nearly lost their home trying to pay medical bills. James watched as George's expression grew more serious with each story. The prince asked question after question about the children's lives, their families' struggles, and the hospital's limitations in providing care. This wasn't the usual polite interest shown during royal visits. How many children can't get treatment because their families can't afford it? George asked quietly. The room fell silent. This wasn't a question anyone expected from a 15-year-old prince. The hospital director shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to answer honestly without seeming to criticize the healthcare system. Well, Your Royal Highness, the director began carefully, we do our best to help everyone, but resources are limited. Some families do face difficult choices. George closed the folder and looked directly at James. The guard saw something in the prince's eyes that made his heart skip a beat. It was the same look he had seen in Prince William's eyes years ago, when he decided to serve as a helicopter pilot in dangerous rescue missions. I need to see these children, George said firmly, not for photographs or publicity. I need to talk to them personally. The photographers exchanged glances. This wasn't part of the planned schedule. Royal visits were carefully choreographed events, not spontaneous meetings with sick children. Your Highness? The palace's press secretary stepped forward. We haven't prepared for extended visits today. Perhaps we could arrange something for next month. No, George said, his voice carrying an authority that surprised everyone in the room. I want to go to the hospital now. I want to meet these children and their families without cameras or reporters. James felt his stomach tighten. He knew this was the moment everything would change. The prince was making a decision that went against all protocols, all security arrangements, and all carefully laid plans. The hospital director looked nervous. Your Highness, we would need to make arrangements, contact security, prepare the staff and families. Then let's make those arrangements, George replied. I'm not leaving until I can speak with these children. The room buzzed with whispered conversations as officials tried to figure out how to handle this unexpected situation. James stepped closer to the prince, knowing that his primary duty was to protect the boy, even if it meant supporting a decision that broke every rule in the royal handbook. George turned to James with a look of determination. Captain Mitchell, will you help me do the right thing? James had served the crown faithfully for over 2 decades, but in that moment, he realized that serving this young prince might require breaking some rules to honor a higher purpose. 3 hours later, James found himself in the children's ward of London's Royal Hospital, watching Prince George sit beside a young girl named Emma, who was fighting leukemia. The prince had insisted on this visit despite the chaos it had caused among palace officials. Emma, only 9 years old, didn't seem impressed by meeting a prince. She was more interested in showing George her collection of colorful bandages and telling him about her favorite nurse who brought her chocolate pudding every Tuesday. My mummy cries, sometimes when she thinks I'm sleeping. Emma confided to George, her small hand reaching for his. She thinks I don't know about the bills piling up on our kitchen table. James watched from the doorway as George listened intently to every word. The prince asked Emma about her dreams, her favorite subjects in school before she got sick, and what she missed most about her normal life. I used to love riding my bicycle to the park with my dad, Emma said wistfully. Now he works 2 jobs to pay for my medicine, so we don't have time for bicycle rides anymore. The conversation continued for nearly an hour. George met with 6 more children, each with their own story of courage and family sacrifice. James had never seen the prince so engaged, so genuinely moved by what he was witnessing. Dr. Sarah Collins, the ward's head pediatrician, approached James while George was reading a story to a group of young patients. She had worked at the hospital for 15 years and had met many important visitors, but none like this young prince. He's different from what I expected, Dr. Collins said quietly. Most VIP visits last 20 minutes with lots of photographs. Your prince has been here for hours, and he's asked more meaningful questions than most adults do. James nodded, feeling a mixture of pride and concern. He was proud of George's compassion, but worried about the consequences of this unplanned visit. His radio had been buzzing with increasingly urgent messages from palace security. Captain Mitchell, George called out, approaching with a determined expression. I need to speak with you privately. They stepped into an empty consultation room where George closed the door behind them. The young prince looked older than his 15 years as he faced the man who had protected him for most of his life. James, I need to ask you something important, George began, using the guard's first name for the first time in years. If I wanted to do something that would help these children, but it meant breaking royal protocol, would you support me? James studied the prince's face carefully. What exactly are you thinking, Your Highness? I want to use my trust fund, George said firmly. The money my great-grandmother left me when I turned 18. I want to establish a foundation that pays for medical treatments for families who can't afford them. James felt his breath catch. The trust fund was worth millions of pounds, intended to provide George with financial independence when he became an adult. Using it for charity would be an unprecedented decision. Your Highness, that's a significant decision. Have you discussed this with your parents? George shook his head. I know they'll try to talk me out of it. They'll say I'm too young to make such choices, that there are proper channels and procedures to follow. But these children need help now, not in 3 years when I'm 18. So what are you asking me to do? I've written a letter. George pulled out the folded paper from his pocket. I want you to deliver it personally to my grandmother, the Queen. It explains my decision and asks for her permission to access the trust fund early for this purpose. James stared at the letter, understanding the weight of what George was asking. Delivering such a request would put him in the middle of a family conflict and potentially end his career. If I do this, James said slowly, it will change everything. Your parents, the palace officials, they won't be happy with either of us. I know, George replied. That's why I'm asking you specifically. You've always told me that honor means doing what's right, even when it's difficult. This is what's right, James. The veteran guard looked at the young prince standing before him, no longer a child, but not yet a man, making a decision that would impact thousands of lives. In that moment, James realized that his role was evolving from protecting the prince's body to supporting his conscience. That evening, James walked through the quiet corridors of Buckingham Palace carrying George's letter. His footsteps echoed against the marble floors as he made his way to the Queen's private study. 23 years of loyal service had led to this moment of choosing between protocol and conscience. The Queen's private secretary looked surprised when James requested an immediate audience. Captain Mitchell, Her Majesty is reviewing state papers. Unless it's an emergency, it concerns Prince George, James interrupted. It's urgent. 10 minutes later, James stood in the elegant study where Queen Elizabeth sat behind her mahogany desk. The room smelled of lavender and old books, filled with photographs of family members and certificates from decades of public service. Captain Mitchell, the Queen said, looking up from her papers, I understand you have something important to discuss regarding my great-grandson. James approached the desk and placed George's letter before her. Your Majesty, Prince George has written you a personal request. He asked me to deliver it directly to you. The Queen opened the envelope with the same careful precision she used for all correspondence. James watched her expression change as she read George's words, her eyebrows rising slightly with each paragraph. The letter was written in George's neat handwriting. Dear Granny, today I met children who are fighting for their lives while their parents fight to pay for treatments. I cannot sleep peacefully in my comfortable bed, knowing that my trust fund could save these families from choosing between their child's life and losing their home. I respectfully request permission to establish a medical foundation using my inheritance. I understand this is unusual, but I believe it is necessary. Your loving great-grandson, George. The Queen set down the letter and looked at James with piercing blue eyes. Did you encourage him to write this? No, Your Majesty. Prince George made this decision independently after visiting the children's hospital today. He was deeply moved by what he witnessed. And you supported his unscheduled visit to the hospital? James straightened his shoulders. Yes, Your Majesty. I believed it was important for the prince to see reality beyond the palace walls. The Queen was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming softly on the desk. She had ruled for over 70 years and had seen many passionate young people with grand ideas about changing the world. Captain Mitchell, in your opinion, is this a momentary emotional response or a deeply considered decision? Your Majesty, I've watched Prince George grow up. I've never seen him more certain about anything. He spent 3 hours at the hospital asking detailed questions about healthcare costs, family struggles, and the hospital's limitations. This wasn't a casual observation. The Queen stood and walked to the window overlooking the palace gardens. When I was George's age, I wanted to join the war effort directly. My father thought I was too young, too sheltered to understand the real world. Perhaps he was right, but perhaps young people sometimes see truths that experience has taught us to complicate. She turned back to James. What do you think will happen if I approve this request? His parents will be upset, James answered honestly. Palace officials will call it unprecedented. The media will have opinions, but thousands of families will receive help they desperately need. And if I don't approve it, Prince George will wait until he's 18 and do it anyway. But in the meantime, children will suffer while their families struggle financially. The Queen returned to her desk and picked up her fountain pen. Captain Mitchell, you've served this family with distinction for over 2 decades. Your loyalty has never been questioned. Why are you supporting what many would call a breach of protocol? James had prepared for this question during his walk to the study. Your Majesty, I swore to protect Prince George. Today I realize that sometimes protecting someone means supporting their moral courage, even when it challenges established procedures. The Queen smiled slightly, the first hint of warmth in their conversation. You sound like my husband would have. He always said that real honor sometimes requires breaking rules designed by people who forgot their original purpose. She began writing on palace letterhead. I'm going to approve George's request, but with conditions. The foundation will be established with trustees who can guide him. He'll work with financial advisors to ensure the money is used effectively, and he'll continue his education while learning about charitable management. James felt relief wash over him. Thank you, Your Majesty. Don't thank me yet, Captain. Tomorrow morning, you and I will need to face Prince William and Princess Catherine to explain why we're supporting their 15-year-old son's decision to give away millions of pounds. The Queen sealed her response in an envelope marked with the royal crest. Deliver this to George tonight. Tell him his great-grandmother is proud of his compassion, but expects him to approach this responsibility with the same seriousness he would give to any royal duty. As James prepared to leave, the Queen added softly, Captain Mitchell, you've proven today that protecting someone sometimes means helping them become who they're meant to be, rather than keeping them safely contained. The morning meeting in Prince William's private office felt like a military tribunal. James stood at attention while William and Catherine sat across from him, their expressions ranging from confusion to anger. The Queen's approval letter lay open on the desk between them. Captain Mitchell, Prince William began, his voice carefully controlled, help me understand how my 15-year-old son managed to convince his great-grandmother to approve the largest charitable donation in recent royal history without his parents' knowledge. James had spent the sleepless night preparing for this confrontation. Your Royal Highness, Prince George was deeply affected by what he witnessed at the Children's Hospital. His decision came from genuine compassion for suffering families. That's not what I asked, William replied firmly. I asked how you allowed this to happen without informing us. Catherine leaned forward, her concern evident. James, we're not questioning George's good intentions. We're questioning the process. Our son made a decision that will affect his entire future, and somehow we were completely bypassed. With respect, Your Royal Highnesses, James said carefully, Prince George specifically asked me to take his letter directly to the Queen because he feared you would delay or prevent his decision. The room fell silent. William stood and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. So my son doesn't trust his own parents to support his charitable impulses? He trusts you completely, James replied. But he believed you would protect him from making what you might consider a rash decision. He didn't want protection from this choice. Catherine studied James's face. You've been with George since he was 7 years old. In your honest opinion, is he mature enough for this responsibility? James considered his words carefully. Your Royal Highness, yesterday I watched Prince George spend 3 hours listening to sick children talk about their family's struggles. He asked detailed questions about medical costs, insurance limitations, and hospital funding. He wasn't making an emotional gesture. He was gathering information to address a problem he had identified. But he's 15, William said, turning back to face them. When I was 15, I thought I could solve world hunger with good intentions. Did you have access to millions of pounds at 15? James asked respectfully. Prince George does. The question isn't whether he's old enough to want to help people. The question is whether we should delay his ability to actually help them. Catherine picked up the Queen's letter and read it again. Mother has outlined strict conditions. Trustees, financial advisors, ongoing education about charitable management. She's not just approving a donation, she's approving a learning experience. An expensive learning experience, William muttered. James took a deep breath before speaking his next words. Your Royal Highnesses, I need to tell you something else. Prince George asked me to support his decision knowing it might cost me my position. He was willing to risk our relationship because he believed this was more important than protocol. Both parents looked surprised. Catherine asked, What do you mean cost you your position? I chose to support Prince George's moral courage over established procedures. I delivered his letter to the Queen without seeking approval from his parents or palace officials. I knew this might be viewed as insubordination. William sat back down, his expression softening slightly. James, you've protected our children for years. We've never questioned your judgment or loyalty. Then I hope you'll consider that I wouldn't support this decision lightly, James replied. I believe Prince George is demonstrating exactly the kind of leadership and compassion we hope to see in future royals. Catherine stood and walked around the desk. James, can you arrange for us to visit the Children's Hospital? I want to see what affected George so deeply. Of course, Your Royal Highness. And I want to meet with the financial advisors and trustees the Queen mentioned, William added. If we're going to support this decision, I want to ensure George learns how to manage such responsibility properly. James felt a wave of relief. So you're not opposing the foundation? William and Catherine exchanged a look that spoke of years of marriage and shared decision-making. Catherine answered first. We're proud that our son wants to help people. We're concerned about the magnitude of his decision, but we're not going to stand in the way of his compassion. However, William added firmly, this sets a precedent. George needs to understand that future decisions of this scale must involve family discussion. He's part of a team, not a lone decision-maker. I believe he understands that now, James said. Yesterday was about urgency and passion. Going forward, I think he'll appreciate having your guidance and support. Catherine smiled for the first time during the meeting. James, thank you for protecting our son's conscience as well as his body. That's not an easy balance to maintain. As the meeting concluded, William approached James with an extended hand. Captain Mitchell, you've served our family with honor for over 20 years. Yesterday, you proved that honor sometimes requires difficult choices. We're grateful for your wisdom. James shook the prince's hand, feeling the weight of the past 24 hours lifting from his shoulders, but he also felt something else changing, something that would reshape his relationship with the royal family forever. 6 months later, James stood in the same children's ward where everything had changed, but this time he wasn't wearing his royal protection uniform. He wore a simple business suit with a badge identifying him as Director of Operations for the Prince George Foundation for Medical Support. The transformation had been remarkable. The foundation had already provided emergency funding for over 300 families facing medical crises. Emma, the 9-year-old girl who had first captured Prince George's attention, was now in remission and had returned to school. Her family had kept their home thanks to the foundation's assistance with her treatment costs. Mr. Mitchell, Dr. Sarah Collins approached with a wide smile. The foundation's latest report shows incredible results. Treatment delays due to financial concerns have dropped by 60% in our region alone. James nodded, feeling a satisfaction he had never experienced during his security career. Prince George reviews every case personally. He insists on reading the family's letters and understanding how the foundation's help has impacted their lives. George, now 16, had matured significantly over the past months. The responsibility of managing millions of pounds in charitable giving had taught him lessons no classroom could provide. He worked with financial experts, met with hospital administrators, and studied healthcare policy with the same intensity he once applied to his royal protocol lessons. James, George called out, approaching with a tablet containing the week's funding requests. I wanted to discuss the application from the family in Manchester. Their daughter needs a surgery that costs more than our usual support limit. They walked to a quiet consultation room where George spread out the application documents. His approach to charitable work had become methodical and thorough, far beyond what anyone had expected from a teenager. The surgery could save her life, George explained, but it's experimental and not covered by the National Health Service. The family has exhausted their savings and borrowed against their home. James studied the medical reports and financial documentation. What do the trustees recommend? They're divided. Dr. Harrison thinks we should approve it as a special case. Mr. Pemberton worries about setting precedent for funding experimental treatments. George looked at James with the same trust he had shown 6 months earlier when asking for help, delivering his letter to the Queen. What do you think? James had learned to balance his protective instincts with respect for George's growing wisdom. What does your research tell you about the success rate of this surgery? 70% success rate at the specialized clinic in Switzerland. The surgeon has performed it successfully 43 times out of 62 attempts. And if the foundation doesn't fund it? George's expression grew somber. She'll likely die within 18 months. Her family will lose everything trying to pay for palliative care. James saw the weight of responsibility in the young prince's eyes. This wasn't the carefree teenager he had once protected from scraped knees and overeager photographers. This was a young man grappling with life and death decisions. Your Highness, James said gently, you've created this foundation to help families facing impossible choices. This family is facing the most impossible choice of all. George nodded slowly. I want to approve it. I know it's expensive and experimental, but that little girl deserves a chance to grow up. Then approve it, James encouraged. You've built safeguards into the foundation to handle exceptional cases. This is why those safeguards exist. George signed the approval documents with steady hands. James, sometimes I wonder if I was too young to take on this responsibility. Do you regret your decision? Never, George answered immediately. But sometimes the weight of it surprises me, knowing that my choices directly impact whether children live or die, whether families stay together or fall apart. It's heavier than I expected. James placed a supportive hand on the prince's shoulder. That weight you feel? That's the weight of real responsibility. Most people your age are only responsible for their homework and chores. You chose to be responsible for saving lives. My parents worry that I'm missing out on being a normal teenager. Are you? George considered the question seriously. I'm missing out on some things. I don't go to parties or spend hours playing video games like my friends. But I'm gaining something too. I'm learning what it means to make a real difference in the world. They returned to the ward where George spent time with current patients, just as he had that first transformative day. James watched from a distance, no longer responsible for the prince's physical safety, but serving as mentor and advisor in this new chapter of their relationship. Dr. Collins joined James as they observed, George reading to a group of young patients. You know, she said quietly, most people who donate large sums to charity never see the direct impact of their gifts. Prince George insists on meeting the families, understanding their stories and following their progress. He's not just funding medical care, he's restoring hope. James smiled, thinking about how dramatically his own life had changed since that day when Prince George had asked him to choose between protocol and conscience. Sometimes the best protection you can give someone is helping them become who they're meant to be. 1 year after the Foundation's establishment, James sat in his small office at the Foundation's headquarters, preparing his final report as Director of Operations. At 52, he had made a decision that would surprise everyone who knew him. He was returning to Royal Protection Services, but with a completely different perspective on what protection truly meant. The Foundation had grown beyond anyone's expectations. Prince George's initial donation had attracted matching funds from other wealthy families and corporate sponsors. The Foundation now operated in 12 countries and had helped over 2,000 families access critical medical care. George, now 17, had become a respected voice in healthcare philanthropy. He spoke at international conferences, consulted with government officials on healthcare policy, and had inspired other young people to become involved in charitable work. The shy prince who once hid behind his security detail now confidently addressed rooms full of world leaders. James, George knocked on the office door, carrying a thick folder. I have the quarterly impact report you requested. They sat together reviewing the numbers that represented real lives changed. Children who had survived cancer treatments their families couldn't afford. Elderly patients who had received life-saving surgeries. Families who had kept their homes while caring for sick loved ones. Emma is starting high school next month, George said, pointing to a photograph in the report. She wants to become a pediatric nurse after her experience here. James smiled, remembering the brave little girl who had first opened George's eyes to the reality of medical financial hardship. She'll make an excellent nurse. James, I need to tell you something, George said, setting down the report. I know you're planning to return to protection services, but I have a different proposal. I'm listening, Your Highness. I want you to become the Foundation's permanent chief operating officer. You understand both the charitable work and the royal protocols. You know how to bridge those two worlds better than anyone. James had expected this conversation. Your Highness, I'm honored by the offer. But you need someone with formal charitable management experience, not an old soldier who learned on the job. I need someone I trust completely, George replied firmly. Someone who supported my conscience when it mattered most. Someone who helped me grow from a protected prince into someone who can actually protect others. The irony wasn't lost on James. For 23 years he had protected Prince George from the outside world. Now George was asking him to help protect vulnerable families from circumstances beyond their control. There's another reason I want you to stay, George continued. My younger siblings are watching what I've done. Princess Charlotte has started asking questions about poverty and education. Prince Louis wants to know why some children don't have enough food. They're going to need guidance in finding their own ways to serve others. James understood the larger picture George was painting. You want me to help them navigate the balance between royal duty and personal conscience? Exactly. You taught me that real protection sometimes means supporting difficult decisions rather than preventing them. Charlotte and Louis will face their own moments of choosing between protocol and doing what's right. James looked out the window at the busy London street below. For over 2 decades, his world had been the controlled environment of royal residences and carefully planned public appearances. The Foundation had introduced him to the messy, urgent, beautiful reality of helping people in crisis. Your Highness, if I accept this position, I won't be able to protect you from criticism when you make controversial decisions. Some people will always question whether young royals should be involved in such significant charitable work. I don't want protection from criticism, George said with a maturity that still surprised James. I want guidance in making decisions worth defending. James made his choice. Then I accept your offer, Your Highness. They shook hands, sealing a partnership that had evolved from protector and protected to mentor and student, to colleagues united in purpose. 6 months later, James stood beside Prince George at a medical conference in Geneva, where the prince was addressing healthcare ministers from 30 countries. The 17-year-old spoke confidently about innovative funding models for pediatric care, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had personally overseen life-saving interventions. After the speech, a healthcare minister from Denmark approached them. Your Royal Highness, my country would like to implement a similar foundation model. Would you consider serving as an advisor? George looked at James before answering. We'd be honored to help. Mr. Mitchell and I have learned that protecting children's health requires creative collaboration between governments, charities, and concerned individuals. As they walked back to their hotel through the Swiss evening, George asked, James, do you ever regret the day I asked you to deliver that letter to my great-grandmother? James thought about the question seriously. He had given up the prestige and security of Royal Protection Service. He worked longer hours for less pay. He dealt with heartbreaking cases and difficult decisions every day. Your Highness, he answered finally, that day I learned the difference between keeping someone safe and helping them become someone worth being. I've never made a better decision in my life. Prince George smiled, the same determined smile James had seen that first day in the children's ward. Thank you for helping me become who I needed to be, even when it meant breaking some rules along the way. As they walked through the quiet streets of Geneva, James reflected on how completely his understanding of service had transformed. For over 2 decades, he had protected one young prince from the world. Now he was helping that same prince protect thousands of vulnerable families from circumstances that could destroy them. The guard's resignation from traditional protection services had led to the most meaningful service of his life.